On February 3, 2026, a search party found Mitchell Blackwood, 47, crawling along Highway 61 near Grand Portage, Minnesota. Blackwood was severely hypothermic, had lost 31 pounds in 8 days, and bore unusual lacerations across his back and chest that doctors later described as consistent with claws, but of no known North American predator. Blackwood was the sole survivor of a 5-person expedition that had ventured into the Boundary Waters wilderness area during an unseasonable January thaw. The bodies of Dr. Samuel Reeves, 53, Anita Martinez, 36, and Derek Carlson, 42, have never been recovered. James Freeman, 38, was found 7 miles from their last campsite. His torso opened in a manner that the Cook County medical examiner called surgically precise and inconsistent with animal predation. What follows is Blackwood's account. My name is Mitchell. I was born and raised in Duluth, Minnesota, though my mother was full-blood Ojibwe from the Grand Portage Band. I've worked as a wilderness guide in the Boundary Waters for 23 years. In winter, I supplement my income with electrical work. I know every lake, portage, and island in the northeastern corner of Minnesota. I've survived 3 bear encounters, and once spent 4 days trapped by a blizzard with nothing but a space blanket and some jerky. What I'm saying is that I'm not some weekend warrior who panics at the first sign of trouble. My grandfather on my mother's side was Thomas Wabishkemang, and respected as a keeper of traditional stories at Grand Portage. When I was a boy, he would tell me about the Wendigo, not the Hollywood monster or the psychological condition colonial doctors named after it, but the real thing. The Wendigo is an ancient spirit of winter, famine, and the northern forests. In our language, we call it the Windigo. My grandfather described them as tall, gaunt beings with hearts of ice, insatiable hunger, and an odor like decaying meat and frozen soil. They hunt in the deepest part of winter when food is scarce and people are weak. The stories always ended the same way. Stay out of the deep woods in winter, and if you hear something that sounds like a human voice calling your name from the trees, walk the other direction. I laughed at those stories as I got older. Cultural metaphors for starvation and cannibalism, I thought. I respected my heritage, but I lived in the modern world. I know better now. James Freeman contacted me in early January about a guided winter camping expedition. The weather had been unusually warm for Minnesota in January, hovering around 20 degrees Fahrenheit instead of the usual sub-zero temperatures. He was bringing friends who wanted to photograph wolves in their winter habitat. I warned him that wolf sightings are rare even for experienced trackers, but he insisted they were willing to try. The money was good, and the conditions were milder than usual, so I agreed. James was ex-military, Army Rangers, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and the hyper-vigilant eyes of someone who'd seen combat. He carried himself with the balanced posture of a man who knew how to move in difficult terrain. He told me he'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan before becoming a wildlife photographer specializing in predator species. He brought a Remington 700 bolt-action rifle, explaining it was a precaution he always took in predator territory. Dr. Samuel Reeves was a wildlife biologist from the University of Minnesota, mid-50s, lean and fit for his age, with a full white beard and wire-rimmed glasses. He specialized in wolf behavior and had spent 15 years tracking and studying pack dynamics across the northern states. His movements were deliberate and economical, no wasted energy. He carried a tranquilizer gun and tracking equipment in a specialized backpack. Anita Martinez was a documentary filmmaker working on a series about threatened North American ecosystems, 36, compact and strong, with black hair pulled back in a practical braid. She had spent years filming in extreme environments from the Alaskan tundra to the Sonoran Desert. She moved with a climber's agility. I later learned she had competed in sport climbing at the national level. She carried 3 different cameras and a small drone in waterproof cases. Derek Carlson was a sound engineer who had worked with Anita on previous projects. Early 40s, tall and heavyset, with a reddish beard and hands that never seemed to be still. He specialized in capturing wilderness soundscapes and animal vocalizations. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of bird and mammal sounds and could identify species by their calls alone. His pack was the heaviest, full of sensitive microphones, windshields, and recording equipment. None of them were amateurs. All had wilderness experience. All were properly equipped. All understood the risks of winter camping. None of them would survive. The trouble began before we even left Grand Marais. I stopped to buy extra supplies at the trading post near the reservation. My mother's cousin, Elizabeth Augutuk, was working behind the counter. When I told her where we were headed, she put her hand on my arm. Her eyes narrowed. "Mitchell, the elders had a council meeting last week," she said, her voice lowered. "There's been talk about strange tracks north of Saginaga Lake. Bigger than wolf, not right for bear." She squeezed my arm. "They're saying the Wendigos are moving south because of the warm winters. The ice isn't thick enough up north anymore." I laughed it off. "Liz, you know those are just stories." Her expression didn't change. 3 hunters from Thunder Bay disappeared last month. Canadian authorities are saying they fell through ice. But no one's found the bodies, and one man's empty jacket was up in a tree. 30 feet up, Mitchell. I thanked her for the warning, but still left with my clients. I should have listened. We drove north on the Gunflint Trail in my Ford F-250 and James's Land Rover. The trucks were loaded with winter camping gear, 4-season tents, Arctic-rated sleeping bags, snowshoes, ice fishing equipment, camp stoves, insulated food containers, emergency medical kits, satellite phones, GPS units, extra batteries, propane heaters, and enough food for 10 days. The unseasonable warmth meant less gear than a normal January trip, but we were still prepared for temperatures to drop suddenly. The plan was to establish a base camp near Loon Lake, then make day trips following Wolf Sign. We would use snowshoes on the portages and cross frozen lakes where the ice was thick enough. Dr. Reeves had radio collar data suggesting 3 wolf packs were active in the area. The drive took 3 hours on roads that became progressively less maintained as we moved north. The last 20 miles were snow-covered but passable. We parked at the Loon Lake access point and began transferring gear to sleds we would pull over the snow and ice. The temperature was 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was clear, there was no wind. We reached our campsite on the north shore of Loon Lake by 3 p.m. It was a sheltered inlet with a stand of old white pines providing a windbreak. We set up 3 tents, one for James and Derek, one for Anita and Dr. Reeves, and one for me. We built a fire pit, collected firewood, and melted snow for drinking water. Derek set up his sound equipment at the edge of camp, placing microphones at varying distances into the surrounding forest. "You'll be amazed what you hear when you amplify the forest at night," he told us, adjusting settings on his recorder. "Especially in winter when sound carries so well over snow." We ate a hot meal of dehydrated stew reconstituted with boiled water. The conversation was professional and focused on the next day's plans. Dr. Reeves had mapped likely wolf movement corridors based on topography and previous data. James and Anita discussed camera placements and light conditions. Everything was normal. The weather was holding. The equipment was functioning. That night, the temperature dropped to 10 degrees. The sky remained clear, with a 3/4 moon illuminating the snow-covered lake. I remember thinking how perfect the conditions were, cold enough to keep the wolves active but not so cold that we'd be suffering. I woke at 2:17 a.m. according to my watch. Derek was standing by the fire pit, his headlamp illuminating his recording equipment. I got up to see what he was doing. "Listen to this," he said, handing me headphones. I put them on. At first I heard nothing, just the ambient sounds of the winter forest. Then I realized what was strange. There were no sounds at all. No insects, no night birds, no distant wolf howls, no rustling of nocturnal animals in the underbrush. "It's completely silent," Derek said. "I've never recorded such a total absence of sound in a wilderness setting. It's like the forest is holding its breath." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I remembered my grandfather's stories about how animals fall silent when the Wendigo passes. I pushed the thought away. "Maybe it's just too cold for much activity," I said, not believing it myself. 10 degrees wasn't that cold for the Boundary Waters. Derek shook his head. No, this isn't right. Even in much colder conditions, there's always something. This is absence. We stood listening to nothing for several minutes. Then Derek stiffened beside me. There, he whispered, adjusting a dial on his equipment. Through the headphones came a sound unlike anything I've ever heard. It was rhythmic, like something between a hum and a purr, but at a frequency that made my teeth ache. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What is that?" Derek asked, his breath visible in the cold air. "I don't know," I said truthfully. "Could be ice shifting on the lake." But it wasn't ice. I'd heard ice shifting hundreds of times. This was something else entirely. The sound stopped abruptly. A minute later, a wolf howled in the distance, a normal, natural sound that somehow made us both relax. The forest was making noise again. We convinced ourselves we had experienced an odd atmospheric phenomenon and went back to sleep. The next morning, we set out north toward Lunar Lake, where Dr. Reeves believed one of the wolf packs had a rendezvous site. The day was overcast with a temperature around 15 degrees, perfect for tracking. The recent light snow held tracks well, and within an hour Dr. Reeves had found wolf prints heading in the same direction we were traveling. Adult male, probably the alpha, he said, kneeling beside a clear paw print in the snow. Based on the depth and stride length, I'd say about 120 pounds. Healthy specimen. We followed the tracks for 3 miles through mixed forest of pine, birch, and aspen. The wolf had been joined by 3 others according to the overlapping tracks. Dr. Reeves was excited, explaining to Anita about pack behavior while she filmed him gesturing at the signs. Around noon, we reached a clearing where the wolves had clearly spent some time. There were beds pressed into the snow, scraps of fur, and the remains of a snowshoe hare they had caught. James set up a remote camera on a tree overlooking the area, hoping the pack would return. That's when Derek noticed something odd about the wolf tracks leading away from the clearing. "They're running," he said, pointing to the widely spaced prints. All of them in the same direction, maintaining the same speed and spacing. Dr. Reeves examined the tracks. "You're right, this is flight behavior. Something spooked them." "Another predator?" James asked, his hand moving unconsciously toward his rifle. "In this ecosystem, wolves are the apex predator," Dr. Reeves said. "Nothing hunts them, nothing that we knew of anyway." Anyway, about 50 yards from the wolf clearing, we found different tracks crossing the wolf's path. At first glance, they resembled barefoot human prints, but much larger, at least 18 inches long. The stride length was over 6 feet. Whatever made them was bipedal but didn't move like a human. The prints were deeper at the front, as if the weight was distributed differently. Dr. Reeves stared at the tracks silently. His scientific demeanor faltered for the first time since I'd met him. "This is impossible," he finally said. "No known animal makes tracks like this." "Could it be a hoax?" Anita asked. "Filming the footprints from different angles. Who would be out here making fake tracks?" James countered. "We're 15 miles from the nearest road." I knelt beside one of the clearer impressions. The print showed what looked like 5 toes, but they were too long, too widely spaced. There were clear claw marks extending several inches beyond the toes, not bear, not moose, not any animal I recognized from 20+ years in these woods. "We should head back to camp," I said, standing up. No one argued. As we turned to retrace our steps, Derek gestured for silence. He titled his head, listening. We all froze, straining to hear what had caught his attention. Nothing. Absolute silence. No birds. No wind in the trees. No distant sounds carrying over the snow, just like the previous night. "We need to move," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. We maintained a quick pace back toward camp, no one speaking. The silence of the forest pressed against us like a physical weight. Every broken twig under our snowshoes sounded like a gunshot. About a mile from camp, the silence broke with a sound that still haunts me. A voice, clearly human but somehow wrong, called out from the dense stand of pines to our right. "Help! Is someone there? I'm hurt." James immediately turned toward the voice, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait, I said. That doesn't sound right. The voice called again, now seeming to come from a slightly different direction. Please, I can see you. I need help. Dr. Reeves frowned. Who else would be out here? We should investigate. No, I said firmly. Something's wrong. The voice is off. What do you mean off? Anita asked, looking between me and the dark pine stand. Before I could answer, James shook free of my grip and moved toward the trees. I'm not leaving someone injured out here, he said. Dr. Reeves followed him. After a moment's hesitation, Anita and Derek went too. I stood frozen, remembering my grandfather's warning. If you hear something that sounds like a human voice calling your name from the trees, walk the other direction. I knew I couldn't leave them. I followed, moving as quietly as possible. James was in the lead, pushing through the dense branches. Hello, where are you? He called. The forest had gone completely silent again. No response came to James's call. We stood among the trees, surrounded by shadows despite the midday hour. The pines were old growth, their branches blocking most of the light. I don't see anyone, Derek said, turning in a slow circle. Hello? If you need help, call out again. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Let's get back to the trail, I urged. This doesn't feel right. We had started to move when James suddenly stopped. Do you smell that? He asked. I did. A heavy, musky odor like rotting meat mixed with wet fur and something else I couldn't identify. Something cold and ancient. It was overpowering, making my eyes water and my stomach clench. A branch snapped overhead. We all looked up simultaneously. What I saw defied rational explanation. Clinging to a thick branch 30 feet above us was something that resembled a human in the way that a wolf resembles a domestic dog. The basic template was similar, but everything was wrong. It was naked despite the cold, its skin a mottled grayish-white that blended with the winter sky. Its limbs were too long, especially the arms, which dangled below what would have been its knees if the joints bent the right way. The head was elongated with no visible ears and only deep recesses where the eyes should have been. Its mouth stretched far too wide across its face, filled with jagged teeth like broken ice. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. Some primal part of my brain recognized this thing from ancestral memory, the windigo of my grandfather's stories made flesh. James raised his rifle but never got a shot off. The creature dropped from the branch, moving so quickly it seemed to blur. It landed directly on James, its weight driving him into the snow. There was a terrible sound, not a scream, but a wet crunch as James's chest caved in beneath it. Dr. Reeves shouted and lunged forward with a hunting knife he pulled from his belt. The creature's arm lashed out, catching him across the throat. Blood sprayed across the snow in a perfect arc. Dr. Reeves collapsed, his glasses landing several feet away. One lens cracked. Anita grabbed my sleeve and pulled. "Run," she screamed. We ran. Derek was ahead of us, moving with surprising speed for his size. We broke from the pine stand onto the open trail, abandoning any attempt at stealth, just running blindly toward camp. The silence had broken. The forest was filled with sounds, branches snapping, something heavy moving through the undergrowth, and that same humming purring sound from the night before, now much louder and coming from multiple directions. Derek suddenly veered left off the trail. "This way," he called. "There's a ranger cabin on Snowbank Lake. It's closer than our camp." I knew the cabin he meant. It was used by Forest Service personnel during summer months, but should be empty now. It was built of sturdy logs and had a solid door, better protection than our tents would provide. We ran for more than an hour, the adrenaline pushing us beyond normal endurance. The short winter day was already fading, the temperature dropping with the sun. We reached Snowbank Lake as twilight settled over the forest. The lake stretched before us, a flat white expanse. On the far shore, maybe half a mile across, I could just make out the dark shape of the ranger cabin. "We need to cross the lake," Derek said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "The ice might not be thick enough," I warned. "This winter has been warm. We don't have a choice," Anita said. She pointed back the way we had come. 3 tall figures stood at the tree line, perfectly still, watching us. Even at this distance, I could see they were similar to the creature that had killed James and Dr. Reeves, but each was slightly different in proportion and stance. One was easily 8 feet tall. "Are those people?" Derek asked, squinting in the fading light. "No," I said, "they're not people." As if hearing my words, the 3 figures began moving toward us with a smooth, gliding gait that covered ground with terrifying speed. "The lake," I shouted. "Go." We moved onto the ice, our snowshoes providing some traction on the slick surface. The cabin seemed impossibly far away. Behind us, the creatures reached the shore but stopped at the ice's edge. They paced back and forth, their movements jerky and bird-like. They seemed reluctant to follow us onto the exposed lake. "They don't like the open space," Anita said. "No cover." We continued across the lake, moving as quickly as we dared. The ice creaked beneath us. In places it was clearly not as thick as it should have been in January. We had to detour around patches of darker, thinner ice. Halfway across, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Howling, but not wolves. The pitch was wrong, too high and wavering. It came from the shore behind us. The tall figures were calling. They received an answer. From the forest on all sides of the lake, the same howling erupted. More of them, many more. "Move faster," I urged. The cabin was tantalizingly close now. A simple log structure with a metal roof and shuttered windows. A stone chimney rose from one end. It represented safety in my mind, though rationally I knew a wooden cabin was hardly adequate protection against the things pursuing us. We were 300 yards from shore when Derek's right foot broke through the ice. He screamed, plunging thigh-deep into the frigid water. Anita and I grabbed his arms, pulling him back onto solid ice. His lower body was soaked. In the sub-zero temperatures of the coming night, wet clothes meant hypothermia and death within hours. "We need to get him inside, get those clothes off, and start a fire," I said to Anita. "Can you help him walk?" She nodded, supporting Derek on one side while I took the other. We half-dragged him the remaining distance to shore. The howling had stopped, which somehow was more terrifying than its presence. The cabin door was locked with a Forest Service padlock. James had had a pry bar in his pack, but James was gone. I used the handle of my hunting knife as a lever against the door frame while Anita steadied Derek, who was already shivering violently. The lock broke with a crack that seemed deafening in the stillness. We stumbled inside, closing the door behind us. The cabin was a single room with basic furnishings, a wood stove, a table with chairs, bunk beds built into one wall, and shelves of emergency supplies. A battery-powered lantern hung from a ceiling beam. I turned it on, filling the cabin with harsh white light while Anita helped Derek remove his wet clothes. I stuffed newspaper and kindling into the wood stove, grateful to find a good supply of split logs stacked beside it. The matches in the emergency kit were dry, and soon we had a fire going. Derek huddled near the stove, wrapped in blankets we found on the bunks. His exposed skin was alarmingly pale, his lips tinged blue. "What the hell were those things?" Anita asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wendigo," I said. "Wendigo. My people have stories about them, ancient spirits of winter and hunger." I didn't mention that the stories always described them as solitary hunters. I'd never heard of Wendigos traveling in groups. "That's a legend," Derek said through chattering teeth. "A myth. 2 men are dead because of a myth," I replied. We fell silent. Outside, the last light faded from the sky. The temperature would continue dropping throughout the night. Our phones had no signal this deep in the wilderness, and our satellite phone was back at the main camp with the rest of our gear. We had no way to call for help. "We need to barricade the door and windows," I said, standing. "Use whatever furniture we can move." Anita helped me push the heavy wooden table against the door. We secured the shutters on the 2 small windows with extra boards we found under the bunks. The cabin had no electricity, so the wood stove and lantern were our only sources of light and heat. "What's the plan?" Anita asked once we'd done everything we could to secure the cabin. "Rest tonight. At first light, we make for the main road. It's about 11 miles northeast of here. If we move fast, we can reach it by noon. If those things let us, Derek said. No one had an answer to that. I took the first watch while Anita and Derek tried to sleep. The cabin warmed quickly with the stove burning hot. Outside, the night was silent again. That unnatural, complete absence of sound that had preceded our first encounter with the creatures. I checked my watch, 11:42 p.m. The fire needed more wood. I opened the stove door quietly to add a log, trying not to wake the others. The humming started. Low at first, almost at the edge of hearing, then growing stronger. It seemed to come from directly overhead, from the roof of the cabin. A rhythmic vibration that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. Anita woke, sitting up on her bunk. "What is that?" "They're on the roof," I whispered. The humming grew louder, joined by a scratching sound, like claws or long fingernails dragging across the metal roofing. The lantern flickered. Shadows moved strangely across the cabin walls. Derek was awake now too. "They can't get in," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This place is solid." A heavy thud came from the door, making the table shift slightly. Another thud. The door frame creaked. "The table won't hold," Anita said. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the wood stove and stood ready. The next impact split the door down its center. Long grayish fingers with black claws worked their way through the crack, widening it splinter by splinter. I raised my hunting knife, knowing how inadequate it was. Derek had found a hatchet in the emergency supplies. We stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the failing door. The humming reached a pitch that made my vision blur. The lantern went out, plunging the entire room into a deep, heavy darkness. Only the red glow from the wood stove illuminated the cabin now. The door gave way with a final crack. The table scraped across the floor. In the dim reddish light, I saw a tall figure duck to enter the cabin. Behind it, more shapes crowded the doorway. What happened next is fragmented in my memory. I remember lunging forward with my knife. I remember a sound like ice breaking on a lake. I remember pain across my chest and back as claws raked through my jacket and into my flesh. I remember Anita screaming, a sound cut unnaturally short. I remember cold beyond anything I've ever felt, not external cold from the winter air flooding through the broken door, but a deep internal cold, as if my blood was turning to ice in my veins. I lost consciousness. When I woke, I was alone in the cabin. The door hung from one hinge. Snow had drifted across the floor. The stove had gone cold. Derek and Anita were gone. There was blood on the walls and floor, but not as much as there should have been. My chest and back burned with pain. I looked down to see my jacket shredded, 5 parallel cuts beneath it leaking blood. They weren't deep enough to be fatal, but in the wilderness, any wound can become life-threatening through infection. It was morning according to my watch, though the light seemed wrong, too gray, too diffuse. I forced myself to move despite the pain. I gathered what supplies remained in the cabin: matches, a small first aid kit, a bag of beef jerky and a metal water bottle. The hatchet was still on the floor where Derek had dropped it. I took that too. I left the cabin and headed northeast toward the main road. The day was overcast, the temperature around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. My wounds made each step agonizing, but fear drove me forward. I don't know how to describe the next 7 days. I moved during daylight hours, covering as much ground as possible. At night, I built small fires in sheltered locations, though each fire felt like a beacon announcing my presence. I rationed the jerky carefully. When it ran out, I had nothing. On the 7th day, I reached Highway 61. My strength was nearly gone. The wounds on my chest had become infected, hot and swollen despite my attempts to clean them. I had eaten nothing for 3 days. I collapsed on the roadside and waited. A snowplow found me late that afternoon. The driver thought I was dead at first. He called an ambulance, which took me to the hospital in Grand Marais. I spent 2 weeks there recovering from exposure, infection, and malnutrition. The authorities mounted a search for the others, but winter storms moved in, making the effort difficult and dangerous. They found the destroyed cabin. They found our abandoned camp at Loon Lake. They eventually found James's body, though the official report lists his death as animal attack species undetermined. I tried to tell them what really happened. The police, the Forest Service rangers, the search and rescue teams, they all listened politely and then ignored everything I said about the wind owl. The medical staff suggested I had experienced hallucinations from hypothermia and trauma. Only the elders at Grand Portage understood. I visited them after I was released from the hospital. My mother's cousin Elizabeth took me to speak with the tribal council. They nodded as I described the tall figures, the humming sound, the unnatural silence in the forest. When I finished, the oldest among them, a man named George Wabiminogabo, spoke. "They are moving south," he said simply. "The winters are not cold enough in the far north anymore. The ice they need is melting. They follow the cold." "What can be done?" I asked. The old man shook his head. "Nothing. They were here before us. They will be here after. They are as much a part of this land as the stones and trees." I sold my guide business. I moved to Arizona, where the sun shines 360 days a year and the winter never comes. I don't sleep well. I wake at every sound. Sometimes when the air conditioning runs too long, I think I can hear that humming. I'm telling this story not because I expect you to believe me, but because you need to be warned. The climate is changing, the north is warming, and the things that have lived in the deepest cold for millennia are being driven south into places where people live, places where people aren't prepared. If you go into the northern forests in winter and find unnatural silence, leave immediately. If you hear a human voice calling for help from among the trees, walk the other direction. If you smell rotting meat and wet fur on a cold day, run. The Wendigo packs are moving, and they are always hungry.